I still remember the moment I first heard the words, and I doubt I'll ever forget them. I must kill you. They weren't whispered in a dark alley or shouted in a crime-ridden street somewhere far from civilization. No, they were allegedly spoken by Prince Harry, a son of the monarchy, directed at none other than his father, King Charles. Can you imagine a son threatening the life of his own father? The thought alone sends a shiver down the spine. And yet, according to sources close to the palace, this was not a fleeting remark, nor a moment of anger that passed with a sigh. It was a declaration, sharp, unrelenting, a line drawn in the sand that nobody in the royal household could ignore. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But why now? Why? After decades of carefully curated public images and secret tensions hidden from the press, would a member of the royal family reach a breaking point like this? What was the provocation? What simmering betrayal, hidden resentment, or perceived injustice could push someone to utter words so violent, so irreversible, against the very person whose life gave them title, legacy, and privilege? These questions are not just hypotheticals. They are at the heart of a storm that has just begun to erupt within the monarchy, one that threatens to shatter centuries of tradition, loyalty, and family bonds. To understand what led to this moment, we have to travel back behind the glittering facade of palaces, ceremonies, and tabloids. We must peer into the moments no camera could capture, the private conversations that never made the news, and the whispers in hallways where history is written in silence. Picture Buckingham Palace late at night, guards stationed at every corridor, the faint echo of footsteps on polished floors. In those quiet halls, tension had been building for years. Small disagreements became grudges, misunderstandings grew into resentments, advice from counselors became accusations of betrayal. And one day, all that pressure, all that pent-up frustration, finally erupted. Some say that Prince Harry had long felt sidelined, a royal cast in a script written by others, forced to act out a role he never fully understood. His voice, stifled for years under the weight of public expectation and familial duty, now found an outlet in confrontation. But the alleged threat was more than just words. It was symbolic, a glimpse into a fracture in the monarchy the world never anticipated. What would drive a son to feel that his only path forward was through such extreme emotion? What secrets had been kept from the public that could explain this? The timing of these revelations is critical. While the monarchy has faced countless scandals over centuries, this is different. It is personal. It is raw. It is a story that does not just concern titles or lands. It concerns blood, legacy, and the fragile bonds that hold the most powerful families in the world together. Prince Harry's decision to take his father to court, alleging attempts to destroy the royal family, marks the opening of a legal and emotional battlefield. And trust me, nothing in recent history has been as shocking, as emotionally charged, or as potentially destabilizing. But let's pause for a moment. You might be wondering, how did it reach this point? What sparked this escalation from simmering resentment to overt legal action and alleged threats of violence? To answer that, we need to consider the broader context. For years, the media has painted a picture of the monarchy as a fortress of protocol, ceremony, and stoicism. Yet behind the cameras, there has always been tension. A father and son, two very different personalities, bound by duty yet separated by conflicting ideals. Public appearances, charity events, and social engagements masked the cracks that had been forming over decades. One of the most startling elements in this saga is the alleged intensity of Prince Harry's emotions. We are not talking about a mild disagreement or a fleeting family spat. Reports suggest moments of rage, despair, and frustration that spiraled into confrontations where words like, "I must kill you," were supposedly uttered. Think about that for a second. A royal son, heir to centuries of tradition, at the edge of fury. Ready to confront his father not just in court, but in words that echo a threat no family should ever have to endure. Can you feel the tension? Can you imagine the atmosphere inside those grand halls, where history meets humanity and raw emotion breaks through centuries of decorum? And the stakes couldn't be higher. We are talking about reputations built over generations, about power, about influence, about a family whose image is intertwined with the identity of a nation. One misstep, One revelation, one court case could send shockwaves not just through the monarchy, but across the globe. Every media outlet, every royal correspondent, every social media platform is watching, waiting, and speculating. The world hungers for the drama, the scandal, the story that pulls back the velvet curtain and exposes the raw humanity beneath the crown. But there is more, far more, than just a simple father-son conflict. According to sources, this court case is the tip of the iceberg. Hidden agendas, secret letters, and private recordings are now emerging, each one threatening to reveal alliances and betrayals that would leave even seasoned royal watchers stunned. Imagine the secrecy, the late-night meetings, the whispered conversations that never reached public ears. What was said in those moments? What threats were made in whispers? What promises were broken in the shadows? And let's not forget the human element. Behind every title and ceremony is a family. A father, a son, and all the relationships that bind them, frayed by perception, misunderstanding, and the weight of expectation. Prince Harry's actions are not just legal maneuvers. They are emotional expressions of frustration, grief, and a deep need to protect what he believes is right. And King Charles, faced with accusations of attempting to destroy the very institution he has spent his life upholding, is not a passive player in this drama. Reports suggest countermeasures, private defenses, and strategic maneuvers aimed at preserving not just his legacy, but the stability of the monarchy itself. Now, here's the part that truly keeps the world on edge. While the media loves to speculate about royal gossip, this story is far more sinister and complex than anyone could imagine. It is not just about titles or public image. It is about survival, both emotional and institutional. The alleged threat from Harry to Charles is not an isolated incident. It is intertwined with the court case, the media strategy, and the revelations that are slowly leaking out. What comes next could rewrite everything we thought we knew about the royal family. Ask yourself this. How do you handle betrayal from those you are supposed to trust the most? How do you navigate a situation where the personal and the institutional collide with explosive consequences? This is not a story about simple conflict. It is about survival, legacy, and the extreme measures people are willing to take when they feel cornered, unheard, or threatened. And as we delve deeper into this tale, the twists will keep coming, each one more shocking than the last. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. No one suspected the war inside Buckingham Palace would turn deadly. Those words, whispered by a former aide who had long walked the echoing halls of the palace, captured a truth that nobody outside the royal inner circle could have imagined. To the public, the royal family appeared poised, polished, and untouchable. Public appearances were flawless, the smiles rehearsed, and every gesture a studied performance. But behind the gilded doors, tension had been building for years, simmering beneath layers of protocol, tradition, and image management. Prince Harry, the younger son of King Charles, had long carried an internal storm. While his older brother, William, seemed to glide effortlessly through the expectations of royalty, Harry struggled against the invisible chains of duty. He had grown up in the glare of the public eye, a life where every move was scrutinized, every word analyzed, and every mistake amplified into scandal. From the moment he could speak, Harry had been a participant in a theater that he did not write, in scripts dictated by advisors, publicists, and even family. And while he was adored by many for his charm and charisma, those closest to him whispered of a restless spirit, a boy who could not fully reconcile his personal identity with the weight of royalty. The calm before the storm was deceptive. In private, Harry's frustration had been mounting. He saw the monarchy as both a source of privilege and a cage. He watched as decisions were made without his input, as policies and family matters were dictated by tradition rather than empathy. Every royal event, every public appearance, was a reminder that his voice often went unheard. And while he maintained the public persona of a dutiful son, inside, there was a growing sense of rebellion, a longing to break free from the invisible chains of history and expectation. Yet it wasn't just personal frustration that created this tension. The palace itself was a pressure cooker, a place where decisions were political, personal, and symbolic all at once. King Charles, a man who had dedicated decades to his role, often struggled to balance tradition with the changing expectations of modern royalty. He had his advisors, his allies, and his own insecurities, all of which contributed to a complex web of dynamics within the family. The slightest disagreement could, and often did, escalate into something much larger, a reflection not just of individual personalities, but of the weight of centuries of royal protocol. For Harry, small moments of conflict often festered into larger grievances. Arguments that might seem trivial to outsiders about public statements, media appearances, or even private family matters became, in his mind, evidence of neglect, betrayal, or disregard for his perspective. He began to see patterns where others saw coincidence. He interpreted silence as opposition, delay as obstruction, and critique as personal attack. Each perceived slight stacked upon the last, forming an emotional barricade that separated him not only from his father, but from the institution he had once revered. And then came the whispers, subtle at first, of things that went beyond family friction. Advisors, some loyal and some opportunistic, began suggesting moves and strategies that, while legally sound, were emotionally provocative. It is said that some documents were prepared in secrecy, letters drafted and hidden, decisions made without Harry's knowledge. Whether these actions were meant to protect the monarchy or to assert control over him, they were perceived as attacks in Harry's mind, fueling a narrative that would soon spiral into legal confrontation. The staff, too, were caught in the storm's slow formation. For decades, palace employees had been trained to maintain discretion, to protect the family's image at all costs. They had witnessed arguments, disagreements, and moments of tension, but nothing on the scale that was about to emerge. The tension was almost tangible, a charged atmosphere where loyalty, fear, and caution coexisted uneasily. Every glance, every conversation carried layers of meaning, and the smallest misstep could be interpreted as betrayal. Public perception, meanwhile, masked the truth entirely. The monarchy was seen as stable, revered, and largely immune to the chaos that could consume ordinary families. Headlines spoke of royal engagements, charitable initiatives, and carefully choreographed appearances. But in those moments of public grace, private discord grew unchecked. The calm was an illusion, and for Harry, it became increasingly unbearable. He began to question not just his role within the family, but the very structures that had defined his upbringing. Friends and confidants describe Harry during this period as restless, preoccupied, and often volatile. He would speak in fragmented bursts of frustration about unfair treatment, secrecy, and the need to assert himself. He reportedly made references, half-joking but with a sharp edge, to drastic measures if things did not change. While some dismissed these statements as emotional exaggeration, those closest to him took note. They were glimpses into a mind increasingly at odds with the world he had inherited. Ironically, the very institutions meant to guide and support him sometimes exacerbated the problem. Advisors who sought to manage his public image inadvertently inflamed his private grievances. Legal counsel, public relations experts, and even family friends offered guidance that often conflicted, creating confusion and deepening the sense of isolation Harry experienced. It was an environment where every decision carried weight, every misstep was magnified, and every interaction was fraught with potential conflict. Yet, even amid the growing tension, Harry maintained a veneer of composure in public. He attended engagements, smiled for the cameras, and spoke warmly at charity events. The contrast between the polished public image and the turbulent private reality was stark, a duality that would eventually play a central role in the unfolding drama. Audiences outside the palace, unaware of the emotional undercurrents, assumed that all was well. Little did they know, a storm was quietly gathering strength, preparing to erupt in ways no one could have anticipated. As the tension reached a tipping point, small incidents began to act as catalysts. Disagreements over minor matters, seating arrangements at formal dinners, phrasing of public statements, even how media interviews were handled, triggered disproportionate responses. For Harry, these were not mere irritations. They were evidence of a deeper pattern of control and neglect. He began to see the monarchy itself as both a source of privilege and a target of his frustration, an institution he simultaneously loved and loathed. And then came the moments that would forever mark this chapter in royal history. Secret meetings that devolved into arguments, letters intercepted or misinterpreted, conversations taken out of context, and advisors acting on assumptions rather than facts. Every action, every word, became a thread in a tangled web of emotion, duty, and perceived betrayal. It was in this charged environment that Harry allegedly reached the point of no return, where words like, "I must kill you," were uttered, not in malice alone, but as a manifestation of years of suppressed emotion, perceived injustice, and a desperate need to be heard. But this storm was not one-sided. King Charles, a man no stranger to pressure, had his own perspective. Years of service, personal sacrifices, and the weight of maintaining a centuries-old institution had shaped his response to conflict. From his point of view, Harry's actions were alarming, unpredictable, and dangerous. Every statement, every legal move, every public appearance was scrutinized for implications that might threaten not just his authority, but the very stability of the monarchy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge familial bonds, legal boundaries, and public perception alike. As we stand at the precipice of this story, it becomes clear the calm was never truly calm. It was a fragile veneer, a temporary suspension of a conflict that had been decades in the making. What followed would not only shock the palace staff and advisors, but also the millions of people who had watched the royal family from afar, believing they understood the dynamics at play. Because the truth, hidden in corridors, private letters, and whispered conversations, was far more dramatic than any headline could capture. And then came the moment that changed everything, when the simmering tension finally reached a breaking point, and every carefully constructed facade began to crumble. But what came next would escalate the situation beyond mere words, beyond private disputes, and into a public spectacle that would capture the world's attention. And in that instant, the calm before the storm became the storm itself, one that nobody, neither staff, advisors, nor the monarchy itself, was prepared to handle. Imagine opening your front door one morning to find an envelope that could change the course of history. Not just any envelope, but one carrying allegations that could shake the monarchy to its core. For King Charles, that envelope reportedly arrived like a thunderclap, delivered not by accident, but by the calculated hand of his own son, Prince Harry. A legal document so explosive, so emotionally charged, that palace aides say it sparked panic among even the most seasoned staff. It was the start of a courtroom drama no one could have scripted, and one that threatened to expose secrets the royal family had spent generations keeping hidden. The papers themselves were meticulously prepared, every sentence drafted with precision. Legal language mingled with personal accusations, weaving a narrative that alleged attempts by King Charles to destroy the royal family. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of that claim. The very person entrusted with preserving the monarchy was accused by his own son of orchestrating its demise. What would you feel if your child leveled such an allegation against you? Shock, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal, perhaps. According to sources, the palace reacted with all of these emotions, and more. But the content of the papers was only the beginning. The timing was equally significant. Reports suggest that Harry's legal team chose the moment deliberately, coordinating the delivery to coincide with public events that would maximize attention. It was not just a private grievance. It was a statement meant for the world. The palace, despite decades of experience handling crises, was suddenly faced with a spectacle that would dominate global media, fuel endless speculation, and cast a shadow over the monarchy itself. For Harry, the decision to take legal action was reportedly motivated by years of frustration, perceived slights, and a growing conviction that the only way to protect his own legacy, and perhaps the institution itself, was through confrontation. But there was more at play than simple emotion. Sources close to the royal family suggest that Harry had accumulated evidence, letters, recordings, and communications that he believed proved a concerted effort to undermine him and, by extension, the continuity of the monarchy. The legal documents were a culmination of months, possibly years, of meticulous preparation. The contents of the court papers are described as devastating. Allegations ranged from manipulation and secrecy to deliberate sabotage. The tone was formal, yet seething with personal grievance, a combination of legal strategy, and emotional catharsis. Advisors to Harry reportedly argued that the documents were carefully crafted to expose wrongdoing without crossing into defamation, a delicate balance in a world where every word could be weaponized. But even so, the impact was immediate and profound. Staffers who handled the envelope reportedly felt a sense of dread as they realized that this was not a routine legal matter. It was a declaration of war within the palace walls. Public reaction, once the news began to leak, was equally intense. Headlines across the world speculated about the alleged conflict, and social media exploded with debate. Supporters of Harry framed him as a courageous whistleblower standing up to an authoritarian figure. Critics painted him as reckless, impatient, and dangerously emotional. Every angle was analyzed, every statement dissected. And while the palace tried to maintain a public calm, insiders describe an atmosphere of fear, urgency, and chaos behind closed doors. One of the most shocking aspects of the case, according to those who have had access to the papers, was the sheer audacity of the allegations. Harry's legal team reportedly claimed that attempts were being made not only to silence him, but to systematically undermine his role within the family, to manipulate public perception, and even to question his fitness to act as a royal representative. Imagine the tension in the palace as advisors debated the implications. How do you respond to accusations from your own son without escalating the conflict further? How do you protect decades of accumulated reputation when the very foundation is being questioned in court? The legal documents also allegedly contained explicit references to specific incidents, private conversations, and meetings that the public had never known about. These were events that, according to Harry's team, demonstrated a pattern of control, secrecy, and calculated undermining. The details were damning enough to cause shock waves, even among those who had worked in the palace for decades. They painted a picture not of casual disagreements, but of intentional efforts that, in Harry's view, endangered the institution and fractured the family itself. And the envelope did not arrive in isolation. It was accompanied by a strategy, a plan for how the documents would be handled publicly. Harry's legal counsel reportedly coordinated with media experts, advisors, and allies, ensuring that the story would gain maximum traction while maintaining a veneer of professionalism. The palace, by contrast, found itself scrambling, unprepared for the scale of the exposure. Meetings were called in emergency sessions. Counselors debated damage control strategies. Every statement, every public appearance, and every media release had to be carefully managed to avoid further escalation. But perhaps the most chilling element of the papers was their tone. Beyond the legal phrasing lay a deeply personal message. Harry had reached a point of utter frustration and felt that no other path remained. The documents were not just legal instruments. They were a cry for recognition, a declaration of autonomy, and, some sources suggest, a warning. Those who read the papers described an unmistakable edge of rage, a sense that years of pent-up emotion had finally boiled over. In short, this was a son who had felt cornered for too long, and now he had chosen confrontation over compromise. And the palace response? According to insiders, it was a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. King Charles, who had faced countless crises during his decades as heir and now monarch, reportedly found the allegations personally devastating. Advisors scrambled to draft responses that would protect both the king's reputation and the monarchy itself. Security measures were heightened. Meetings were convened in private, with lawyers and counselors weighing every possible scenario. Every action had to be calculated, because the fallout of missteps could extend far beyond the palace walls. This is where the stakes truly become apparent. The court papers were not merely a legal maneuver. They were a turning point in a family saga that had captivated the world. They represented a challenge to centuries of tradition, a confrontation that blurred the line between private grievance and public spectacle. And for Harry, they were a means of asserting control over a situation that had long fell out of his hands. The documents, meticulous and deliberate, symbolized both rebellion and desperation, a combination that would ignite a series of events no one could have predicted. But the implications extended beyond the family drama. These court papers set the stage for media scrutiny, public debate, and political concern. Every allegation, no matter how minor, was dissected in the press, interpreted as either a confirmation of wrongdoing or a cynical attempt to manipulate perception. The global audience, already fascinated by the monarchy, now had a story that combined the elements of betrayal, scandal, and legal intrigue into a single, compelling narrative. The world was watching, and the palace was under pressure like never before. It's also worth considering the human dimension. Prince Harry, though often portrayed as impulsive or reactive, reportedly approached the court action with meticulous planning. This was not a spontaneous outburst. It was the culmination of years of observation, emotional processing, and careful consideration. The legal papers were both shield and weapon, a way to assert truth as he saw it, to protect himself, and, perhaps, to challenge the institution he loved yet resented. At the same time, the impact on King Charles was profound, raising questions about loyalty, authority, and the very nature of family. And yet, even amid the tension and drama, there remained uncertainty. Every palace official, every advisor, every member of the royal household understood that the fallout from these papers could not be contained. Once the allegations became public, control over the narrative slipped. Leaks were inevitable. Media speculation was unstoppable. Public perception could no longer be managed behind closed doors. And as the first headlines appeared, the full scale of the crisis became clear. The royal family was about to face its most explosive conflict in decades, and the world would be watching every move. The envelope that started it all, once innocuous in its appearance, had unleashed a chain reaction. The court papers were not simply documents. They were a declaration, a challenge, and a revelation. They represented anger, grief, and the desperate need to be heard. And as advisors and family members scrambled to respond, it became apparent that the storm was only beginning. Because what came next, the reactions inside the palace, the strategies devised behind closed doors, and the public spectacle that would follow, would escalate far beyond legal maneuvering. And in that escalation, secrets would be revealed, loyalties tested, and the very notion of what it meant to be a royal would be called into question. But what came next would expose fractures that had been hidden for generations, and no one, neither the palace staff, the monarchy, nor the public, was prepared for the revelations that were about to surface. 3 words changed everything. "I must kill you." Allegedly uttered by Prince Harry, these words sent ripples of fear, disbelief, and shock through Buckingham Palace. Imagine the scene: a son, heir to centuries of tradition, facing his father, the king, and letting loose words that could shatter not only family bonds but the foundation of a monarchy. Staffers say the moment froze time itself. The polished halls of the palace, usually alive with protocol and procedure, suddenly filled with tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Those words weren't just angry. They were electric, explosive, and profoundly unsettling. But let's rewind for context. Prince Harry had been under immense pressure for months, even years. Every family conflict, every perceived slight, had built upon the last, creating an emotional storm that no amount of royal poise could contain. While the public only ever saw his charming smile at charity events or his composed demeanor during official engagements, behind closed doors, a very different narrative was unfolding. He reportedly felt unheard, marginalized, and pushed to the edge. And then came the legal battle against his father, a move that only intensified the tension and brought every simmering grievance into the light. The alleged threat didn't happen in isolation. Palace insiders describe a series of confrontations in private chambers, meetings where words escalated from sharp disagreements to biting accusations, and finally to statements that shocked even those familiar with royal tempers. It was as if years of suppressed anger and frustration had found a voice that could no longer be contained by politeness, tradition, or caution. The phrase, "I must kill you," was reportedly the culmination of a crescendo of rage, a raw emotional outburst that captured the depth of Harry's feelings toward the pressures, betrayals, and perceived injustices he had endured. Security teams were reportedly among the first to respond. Staffers recall how bodyguards and palace aides acted swiftly, moving to de-escalate the confrontation. Yet even they were caught off guard by the intensity of the moment. Imagine standing in a room where a son faces his father with such vehemence, and the words, "I must kill you," hang in the air. Fear, disbelief, and urgency collided. Actions had to be measured yet immediate. One wrong move could escalate a personal confrontation into an international scandal. What fueled Harry's rage? According to insiders, there were multiple layers. On a personal level, he had long felt overshadowed by his elder brother, Prince William, and frustrated by the expectations placed upon him by both his father and the institution of monarchy. On a systemic level, he perceived deliberate attempts to control, manipulate, or undermine his role within the royal family. Every decision, every policy, every interaction seemed to contribute to a growing narrative in Harry's mind, that the institution he had been born into was working against him and against what he believed to be the rightful interests of the family. The intensity of the moment was compounded by the stakes involved. Harry wasn't simply venting frustration. According to sources, his threat reflected deep-seated fears and a sense of desperation. The court case was already underway. Accusations were mounting, and public attention was intense. In this context, the alleged outburst was more than a statement of anger. It was a manifestation of emotional pressure pushed to its limit, a reaction that highlighted the fragility of the personal and institutional bonds within the monarchy. What's remarkable is the emotional complexity of the scene. King Charles, despite his decades of experience navigating crises, reportedly found himself shocked and uncertain. While he had faced criticism, media scandals, and internal conflicts before, the notion that his own son could utter such words was unprecedented. For the king, the challenge was twofold: maintain composure in the face of an extraordinary provocation and simultaneously protect the stability of the institution he had spent a lifetime upholding. It was a moment that tested both fatherhood and kingship in ways no previous generation had faced. The psychological dimension is equally compelling. For Harry, expressing his anger verbally was reportedly both a release and a strategic maneuver. Years of feeling unheard had created a boiling point, and those 3 words captured the intensity of his emotion in a way that ordinary complaints or arguments could not. It was, in essence, an ultimate declaration of power, frustration, and defiance. And while the words themselves may seem extreme, insiders argue that they were a reflection of deep-seated anguish and a sense of moral urgency, an assertion that the system was broken and that he would no longer stand by silently. Meanwhile, the palace reacted in a flurry of precautionary measures. Security protocols were reviewed and reinforced. Meetings were held to assess the situation, and key advisors were brought in to manage both the immediate crisis and potential fallout. Every decision had to balance emotional sensitivity with institutional responsibility. The world was watching, and even a minor misstep could escalate the situation from a private confrontation to a public spectacle with global repercussions. This moment also triggered a cascade of internal tension. Staffers, who had long maintained strict discretion, found themselves caught between loyalty to the monarchy and concern for the safety and stability of the family. Advisors debated whether the outburst was a temporary lapse of judgment or a sign of a deeper, more persistent conflict. The palace, it seems, had never faced a situation quite like this, where personal emotions collided so violently with institutional imperatives. Adding fuel to the fire was the growing media attention. Leaks and speculation began to emerge almost immediately, even as the palace attempted to contain the situation. Headlines hinted at conflict without revealing details. Social media erupted with conjecture, and the public hungered for every morsel of information. The combination of internal chaos and external scrutiny created a pressure cooker environment. Every move by the royal family was dissected, and every decision, even a minor one, carried enormous weight. And yet, amid this tension, the story was far from complete. Sources close to Harry describe him as oscillating between fury and reflection, a young man caught in the relentless tide of personal grievance, historical legacy, and public expectation. The alleged threat was a peak, a moment of emotional intensity, but it was also a prelude to actions that would unfold in courtrooms, behind closed doors, and on the global stage. What happened in that room was only the first act of a drama that would unfold in ways no one anticipated. Consider the irony. A family that had spent centuries cultivating an image of stoicism, control, and grace was suddenly exposed to its most human and volatile elements. A son's emotional outburst, a father's shock, and a palace scrambling to contain the situation, all under the scrutiny of a global audience. It was a collision of personal emotion and institutional responsibility, a storm that combined fear, love, anger, and duty into a combustible mix. For the audience, the story raises difficult questions. How do you reconcile love and loyalty with anger and betrayal? What do you do when tradition and emotion collide so violently that even the most established protocols cannot contain them? The alleged threat of violence, though shocking, is a window into the emotional and psychological complexity of family relationships at the highest levels of power. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That even royalty is human, and that the pressures of legacy, expectation, and control can create fractures that are impossible to ignore. And yet, for all the drama, there is a sense of inevitability. Insiders suggest that the alleged threat was not a random explosion of emotion, but the culmination of years of frustration, miscommunication, and systemic tension. Every disagreement, every perceived slight, every moment of feeling unheard contributed to the breaking point. The three words, "I must kill you," were the emotional apex of a storm long in the making, a moment that crystallized decades of conflict into a single, unforgettable statement. But even this moment, dramatic and terrifying as it was only the beginning. The palace and the monarchy were about to face revelations, legal maneuvers, and public scrutiny that would escalate the crisis far beyond anything imaginable. Secrets would surface, loyalties would be tested, and the world would see a side of the royal family previously hidden behind centuries of protocol. And the question that now hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable, was this: what would happen next? How would the monarchy respond? And what lengths would Harry go to in order to assert his voice, his position, and his version of truth? Because what came next, the confrontation, the courtroom maneuvers, and the cascading revelations, would not just shock the palace staff, the royal family, and the public. It would redefine the boundaries of loyalty, duty, and familial conflict forever. What happens behind the doors of Buckingham Palace is a world few ever glimpse, a labyrinth of history, protocol, and secrecy that shields the most powerful family in Britain from the public eye. But now, those walls were beginning to leak, and the secrets inside were starting to emerge in ways that would shock even the most seasoned royal watchers. Prince Harry's legal battle and alleged threat to King Charles had set off a chain reaction, exposing fractures, alliances, and betrayals that had long been hidden behind a polished veneer of tradition. It's hard to overstate the complexity of life inside the palace. For centuries, the royal family has operated under a strict code: loyalty, discretion, and silence. Every conversation is carefully measured, every action calculated. Yet, no matter how disciplined the environment, tension always finds a way to seep through the cracks. For Harry, those cracks were the fault lines of decades of suppressed emotion, perceived injustice, and secrecy that had built up around him. What he saw as betrayal, others may have seen as protocol or tradition, but to him, the line between personal grievance and institutional failure had blurred. Insiders describe private chambers where arguments simmered late into the night, long after cameras were gone and public appearances concluded. In these rooms, tempers flared, voices were raised, and family members confronted one another with raw honesty that rarely, if ever, reached public ears. Imagine the intensity: a father attempting to maintain authority, a son pushing back with decades of frustration, and advisors caught in the middle, trying to navigate both the personal and institutional stakes. Every word carried weight, every tone was scrutinized, and every gesture could be interpreted as support, opposition, or betrayal. Among the most shocking revelations emerging from these private moments are secret letters and communications that suggest a pattern of manipulation and miscommunication within the family. According to sources, some documents reveal attempts to influence public perception, to sway opinion, and even to control the personal choices of family members. For Harry, discovering these letters reportedly felt like a violation of trust on a monumental scale. It was one thing to feel unheard. It was another to realize that actions had allegedly been taken behind his back to shape a narrative he had no control over. The palace, for all its grandeur, is also a place of intense scrutiny and surveillance. Staffers, advisors, and aides have long been trained to observe, report, and anticipate the needs of the family. Yet even they were reportedly caught off guard by the scale and intensity of Harry's confrontation. Private conversations, once thought secure, became part of the unfolding drama, and the line between personal grievance and public spectacle blurred dangerously. Every whispered comment, every private conversation, and every subtle gesture became evidence or ammunition in a conflict that had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. One of the most fascinating aspects of these revelations is the insight into how Harry perceived the institution itself. While many outsiders view the monarchy as a symbol of stability and continuity, for Harry, it was a web of control, restriction, and hidden agendas. Reports suggest that he began to see the palace not just as a home, but as a system designed to constrain him, limit his voice, and dictate his path. This perception fueled his anger and contributed to moments of confrontation, including the alleged threat to King Charles. It's a perspective that adds layers of complexity to the story. This is not simply a son lashing out at his father, but a royal trying to navigate and challenge the structures that have defined his life since birth. The intrigue doesn't stop there. Allies and confidants close to Harry describe an environment where secrecy was currency. Every decision, every plan, every conversation carried implications that could ripple across the family, the institution, and even the public. Some advisors allegedly worked quietly to support Harry, providing information, legal guidance, or strategic counsel. Others, however, reportedly acted to undermine him, whether out of loyalty to the king, fear of public backlash, or personal ambition. The result was a palace rife with tension, a complex dance of loyalty and deception that few could fully navigate. It's also important to consider the role of Meghan Markle in these behind-the-scenes dynamics. Sources suggest that her influence, counsel, and perspective added another layer to the unfolding drama. As an outsider who had become deeply entwined in the royal structure, she reportedly brought both support and controversy to the table. Her involvement in strategic discussions, public messaging, and private family interactions is said to have intensified existing tensions, creating both opportunities and conflicts for Harry as he pursued his legal and personal objectives. And then there are the alleged secret recordings, conversations, and letters that began surfacing in various forms. Some of these documents reportedly contained candid reflections from family members, unguarded moments of frustration, and insights into relationships strained by expectation and duty. For Harry, these revelations were both validating and infuriating. Validating in that they confirmed some of his suspicions, and infuriating in that they highlighted a pattern of secrecy and control that had long influenced his life. The palace, accustomed to controlling narratives, suddenly found itself facing leaks, revelations, and a media storm fueled by materials that had never been intended for public consumption. What is remarkable about this stage of the drama is the interplay between personal emotion and institutional obligation. King Charles, for example, faced the delicate task of maintaining authority, protecting the family's reputation, and responding to his son's grievances, all while navigating the intense public scrutiny that had already begun. For Harry, the challenge was different but equally complex, asserting himself, addressing perceived injustices, and seeking a path forward in a system that had long constrained him. Every action taken behind closed doors was a negotiation between these forces, a high-stakes game of strategy, perception, and survival. The human element of the story cannot be overstated. Behind every legal filing, every whisper in the palace, and every private conversation are emotions that resonate universally: anger, betrayal, love, and the desire for recognition. Harry's actions, though extreme, reflect a struggle that many can relate to on some level: the struggle to be heard, to assert one's voice, and to confront those who hold power over one's life. And yet, the stakes here are unprecedented. This is not a corporate boardroom, nor a domestic disagreement. It is a confrontation within one of the most historically significant families in the world, with implications that ripple across institutions, nations, and public consciousness. Even staffers, whose loyalty has been tested through decades of service, were forced to navigate a labyrinth of conflicting duties. Protecting the family, supporting the institution, and safeguarding individual members became increasingly complicated as private grievances spilled into legal action and media scrutiny. Every decision carried the potential for catastrophic consequences, not just personally, but institutionally. The palace, for all its tradition and stability, found itself in uncharted territory, a family conflict elevated to national, and ultimately global, attention. And while much of the palace drama remained hidden, the leaks and rumors that did escape painted a picture of tension, fear, and strategic maneuvering. Advisors debated whether to intervene directly or let the conflict play out, weighing the risks of escalation against the potential fallout of silence. The alleged threat from Harry to King Charles, combined with the court documents, created a situation where every stakeholder was forced to choose sides, whether publicly or privately. Alliances formed and shifted, loyalties were questioned, and the very definition of family became entangled with power, influence, and survival. What becomes clear from all these behind-the-scenes revelations is that the royal family, for all its prestige and history, is subject to the same emotional dynamics that affect any family, but magnified by public scrutiny, historical expectation, and institutional complexity. The palace walls, which have long shielded private life from the world, were no longer impermeable. Secrets were emerging, and with each revelation, the stakes grew higher. The drama was no longer confined to private spaces. It had begun to spill into courtrooms, media coverage, and public discourse, creating a spectacle that the monarchy had never faced in quite this way. And the most chilling aspect of it all, according to insiders, the revelations behind closed doors were only the beginning. Letters, recordings, and conversations hinted at even deeper conflicts, unseen alliances, and intentions that had remained hidden for decades. Harry had unearthed a complex web of intrigue, secrecy, and manipulation that suggested the palace was far more fragile than the world had been led to believe. What began as personal frustration had become a confrontation with centuries of power, tradition, and expectation. But what came next, the decisions, the confrontations, and the public fallout, would push the royal family into a conflict that was no longer just private. Secrets that had been buried for generations were on the verge of being exposed, and no one inside the palace could predict how the world would react once the truth began to surface. Even in a family as seemingly impenetrable as the royal family, alliances are never permanent. Loyalty is measured, tested, and often transactional, and in the midst of Prince Harry's escalating confrontation with his father, the cracks in those alliances began to widen. Allies who had once been steadfast reportedly began questioning their support, torn between duty to the king, fear of public scandal, and the unpredictable force of Harry's actions. The palace, a place where loyalty is currency, became a battlefield, and Harry was discovering that even the closest confidants could turn against him in subtle, insidious ways. It started quietly. Advisors who had previously encouraged Harry's autonomy, who had whispered reassurances in private corridors and offered guidance behind closed doors, began to waver. Some withdrew entirely, citing concern for the institution, while others reportedly shared sensitive information with King Charles's team, whether to protect themselves or out of genuine loyalty. Imagine the emotional impact of realizing that those you trusted the most, the people you relied on to navigate a labyrinthine institution, were now working to undermine you. The sense of betrayal, according to insiders, was profound. And betrayal, in the palace, often wears a mask of propriety. Publicly, many of these allies continued to smile, to nod in agreement during official events, and to maintain the image of solidarity. Privately, however, conversations were cautious, strategic, and revealing. Advisors debated every word Harry spoke, every legal filing he submitted, and every interaction he had with the media. They acted as intermediaries, filtering information, interpreting motives, and sometimes even shaping Harry's actions in ways he did not realize. It was a subtle form of manipulation, one that could undermine even the most calculated strategies. One of the most insidious aspects of this dynamic was the role of perception. Harry's allies began to question his decisions not because they doubted his intentions, but because they feared the consequences. The monarchy is an institution built on centuries of precedent, and breaking from tradition carries enormous risk. Advisors reportedly cautioned Harry against public confrontations, legal filings, and statements that could escalate the conflict. Some framed these warnings as concern for his well-being, while others positioned themselves as protectors of the monarchy. But to Harry, these interventions increasingly felt like interference, and he began to perceive manipulation where there may have been caution. The psychological effect was profound. Harry, already feeling isolated, began to doubt not just his allies but the very strategies he had relied upon. Every misstep, every disagreement, and every withheld piece of information became another layer of tension. He reportedly began questioning his judgment, wondering who truly supported him and who had their own agenda. The palace, meanwhile, was aware of this emotional vulnerability and, according to insiders, some advisors used it to their advantage. They guided decisions subtly, shaping outcomes in ways that seemed benign on the surface but served institutional interests behind the scenes. Betrayal in this environment is rarely dramatic. There are no overt confrontations, no shouting matches in public corridors. Instead, it manifests through careful omission, strategic withholding of information, and quiet persuasion. Advisors who once provided guidance may suddenly change their advice. Allies who once championed a course of action may subtly steer the narrative in another direction. In Harry's case, these shifts reportedly compounded his sense of urgency and frustration, feeding the perception that he was facing not just his father, but an entire network of influence determined to constrain him. Even family members, who were expected to act as neutral mediators, reportedly became enmeshed in the web of manipulation. Siblings, cousins, and extended relations found themselves navigating complex loyalties, balancing personal affection with duty, and often making choices that inadvertently intensified the conflict. What had begun as a dispute between father and son expanded into a network of tension and intrigue, with alliances forming, breaking, and reforming in ways that were difficult to predict. For Harry, the realization that some of his closest allies might be working against him was both shocking and emotionally devastating. Part of this betrayal was strategic, and part of it psychological. Advisors who aligned with King Charles reportedly sought to destabilize Harry's emotional footing, to introduce doubt and hesitation at critical moments. According to sources, they provided selective information, interpreted events in ways favorable to the king, and at times emphasized risks in a manner that subtly undermined Harry's confidence. While these actions were framed as protective or procedural, the effect on Harry was disorienting. He began to feel that the forces arrayed against him were not only institutional but personal, a tangled mix of loyalty and manipulation that left him increasingly isolated. The stakes of this shifting landscape could not be overstated. Every decision Harry made, every statement, and every public move had the potential to either solidify his position or further erode his support. The court case against King Charles, already a dramatic and risky endeavor, now took on additional layers of complexity. Harry was no longer navigating just legal and familial challenges. He was also contending with subtle sabotage and emotional manipulation from those he had considered allies. Every miscalculation could have consequences not just for his personal credibility, but for the future of the monarchy itself. This dynamic also heightened the emotional intensity of the palace. Staffers describe an atmosphere of tension, where even routine interactions were charged with suspicion. Advisors whispered, glanced, and measured every word. Trust became fragile, and every relationship carried the risk of exposure, betrayal, or manipulation. Harry, already feeling isolated and frustrated, reportedly began to perceive enemies in unlikely places, adding fuel to a fire that was already dangerously hot. And then there were the rumors and leaks. As internal tensions escalated, information began to slip outside the palace walls, whether through inadvertent disclosures, deliberate leaks, or the actions of those seeking to influence public perception. Media coverage began to speculate about fractured alliances, secret strategies, and hidden motives. Headlines hinted at betrayal without revealing specifics, creating a feedback loop. Harry saw the leaks, advisors worried about media fallout, and the public became increasingly captivated by the drama. It was a perfect storm of intrigue, perception, and tension, all centered on a conflict that had begun as private but was rapidly becoming global. Amid all this, Harry reportedly began to take a more aggressive approach. Feeling unsupported by former allies and increasingly frustrated by the manipulation he perceived, he escalated his legal actions, pursued additional evidence, and allegedly delivered more confrontational statements in private settings. Every move was calculated to assert his autonomy, yet every step also increased the risk of alienating those who might have otherwise remained neutral or supportive. It was a delicate balancing act, one fraught with emotional and strategic peril. The emotional stakes were deeply personal. Harry reportedly felt that he had little choice but to act decisively. Years of perceived betrayal, manipulation, and marginalization had pushed him to a point where legal action and confrontation seemed not only necessary but inevitable. And while some advisors attempted to temper his approach, suggesting patience or diplomacy, Harry's perspective was reportedly one of urgency. The time for subtlety had passed. If the monarchy, the family, or his allies would not act in alignment with his sense of justice, he would take matters into his own hands. But what makes this chapter of the story truly gripping is the unpredictability. In the palace, where tradition and protocol usually dictate behavior, the combination of personal betrayal, strategic manipulation, and emotional intensity created a volatile environment. Allies could shift sides at any moment. Advisors could influence outcomes subtly yet decisively, and family members' loyalties were constantly being tested. For Harry, this meant that every decision carried not just immediate consequences, but ripple effects that could resonate across the entire royal family. And as the palace braced for the next phase of the drama, legal confrontations, media storms, and public scrutiny, it became clear that the web of betrayal and manipulation would play a decisive role. Harry's allies, once thought to be a source of support, had become a factor in the conflict itself, influencing outcomes in ways both subtle and profound. The combination of emotional stakes, legal challenges, and shifting loyalties ensured that the drama was only beginning, and that each move would need to be calculated with precision, courage, and resilience. But what came next? The courtroom battles, secret alliances, and public confrontations would push Harry and the royal family into uncharted territory. And in that territory, the consequences of betrayal and manipulation would become painfully, inescapably clear. The courtroom was packed, though not with the public the royal family typically attracted for ceremonies or charity galas. Instead, it was filled with lawyers, advisors, journalists, and a few carefully selected observers, each aware that history was unfolding in real time. Prince Harry had officially taken his father, King Charles, to court, alleging a pattern of attempts to destroy the royal family. And now the public spectacle of legal confrontation was about to begin. The tension in the room was palpable. You could feel it in the stiff posture of the staff, the sharp intake of breath from spectators, and the subtle glances exchanged by those who understood the high stakes. The opening moments were deceptively calm. Court personnel moved with precision, ensuring order while advisors whispered last-minute strategies to both sides. Yet behind the polished professionalism, the air was charged with anticipation. Legal observers had long argued that the monarchy's internal conflicts were untouchable by public law, insulated as they were by tradition and influence. But here, in a courtroom lined with austere wood panels and solemn faces, centuries of protocol collided with the harsh glare of modern legal scrutiny. For Harry, this was a moment to assert not just his grievances, but his voice, a voice he had long felt stifled within the walls of the palace. The proceedings began with opening statements that were carefully calibrated to both set the narrative and maintain legal footing. Harry's counsel spoke first, laying out allegations that would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. They painted a picture of deliberate manipulation, secrecy, and institutional pressure intended to marginalize him and control his actions within the family. The language was precise, formal, yet charged with the undercurrent of personal grievance. Every word seemed designed to communicate not only legal intent, but also emotional truth, a duality that captivated both legal professionals and observers alike. King Charles's response was measured but firm. The court could sense the weight of the institution behind every gesture, the careful calibration of emotion, and the effort to protect both personal reputation and familial legacy. Sources suggest that the king's legal team emphasized tradition, duty, and precedent, positioning their arguments as necessary to preserve the stability of the monarchy. The tension was in the contrasts. Harry, representing personal grievance and individual perception of betrayal. Charles, representing centuries of continuity and institutional authority. Every exchange was laden with subtext, every pause pregnant with meaning. From the audience perspective, the drama unfolded like a story in layers. Observers could see the strategies, the emotional stakes, and the subtle power plays as they occurred. Every gesture, leaning forward, a quiet note passed to counsel, a hand brushing against a stack of documents, carried significance. Those familiar with palace dynamics interpreted these movements as more than procedural. They were part of a battle as old as monarchy itself, where influence, perception, and timing were as important as law. Harry's emotions reportedly ran high during the early moments of the trial. Witnesses describe him as controlled but visibly tense, leaning into moments when the weight of his argument intersected with personal history.